Paul's point in Ephesians 5 is that culture is at war against God. And what are you going to do about it? And the solution in Ephesians 5, verses 7 through 14 is not go vote the right way. What are you going to do about it, Paul says, and he's going to describe a life that goes from darkness to light. What this picture is of here in Ephesians 5, verses 7 through 14 is about people that are born into darkness, that will leave the darkness and come to the light. That's what this is describing. If you understand that you're born without saving faith, then you are born into a culture that is at war against God. Whether the American culture, the Israeli culture, the Roman culture, you're born into a culture that is at war against God. You're going to grow up in that culture. You're going to grow up with the vices that are described in Ephesians 5 being normal in the world around you. And then at some point, you come to faith in Christ and you are transferred from the domain of darkness, to use the language of Ephesians 2, you're transferred from the domain of darkness into the kingdom of his light. So you go from darkness to light at your conversion. And your life gets altered and you go from living in darkness to living in the light, from being darkness to being light. That's the change that takes place as you're, in a sense, relocated. That's what Paul is describing in Ephesians 5, verses 7 through 14. That transfer from darkness to light, and then how you live that out, how that transfer manifests itself in your life. Earlier in Ephesians 5, he was talking about very personal sins. Our first sermon in this series, I titled Not Even a Hint, because of the language in Ephesians 5, verse 2. There should be not even a hint of sexual immorality in the church. Next sermon I titled Not Even a Whisper, because Paul says there should be no hint of that foolish or coarse jesting and crude joking, filthy speech. It's out of place, he says in verse 4. So there should be not a hint of sexual immorality, not even a whisper of inappropriate speech. And this little paragraph here I'm calling Not Even a Shadow, because he says that as Christians go from darkness to light, they should be putting the shadows behind them. They should be putting the darkness behind them and living out in the light. And what transitions here between the very personal sins of a sexual nature at the beginning of Ephesians 5 to sins of a verbal nature coming from the heart, very personal, it's what you're speaking, it's out of your heart. He's going to a more cultural phenomena here, that you're living in a culture that speaks of sinful activity, that celebrates sinful activity, that they do some deeds in secret that are shameful, and you're expected to condone them, or at the very least not draw attention to them, just to accept them and move on. That's the culture he's describing, and you're going from that to leading a life in the light. And so he's moving from personal sins to sins that are happening in the world around you. And so that's why it's important to locate this paragraph in your mind. It's important to locate it in a cultural context, in a culture that celebrates sin and promotes immorality, as do all cultures. And then to challenge you to move from darkness to light.